We're going to look now at what exactly the ethical problem is. Why is it we bother to study ethics? What are the questions that are surrounded? They're very fundamental ones. We've established that the Code of Ethics assumes a number of ethical ideas, and what we want to do now is just look at why is that important to people. If you speak to people, most people know, or at least say they know, what unethical is. But really when we get down to it, especially when you take the common belief that there are many different moral systems, many different ethical systems, it leaves us wondering, what is it that is common about all this? Especially when, as we saw before, for a profession, it's a matter of the self-restraint to not act what's in your self-interest, even though you have the power and the inclination to do it. And so that means that ethics is always something that one person might rely on in terms of the values of another, someone who, in a sense, has the ability to do something wrong with them. Okay. So I've got questions like a very fundamental one. We can look at almost any moral issue. What is a lie? What is the truth? What are property rights? What is just as opposed to legal? And how does that relate to what is fair or equitable? The reality is that many people want to practice vice. They understand what vice means. I want to rob a bank. I know that robbing a bank is wrong in some sense, but I still want to do it because it benefits me. So for me, it's a good thing to do. How do I work out where it all fits in? And especially the idea that most people who break the law know exactly what the law's about. If I want to rob a bank, it's not because I'm ignorant of what bank robbing is in the eyes of the community, but it's because I know precisely what it is, but I happen to want to go and do that thing. And it's the job of some aspects of society, the police and the legal system, what have you, to discourage me, hopefully to, in some way reprogram my ethical thinking so that when I get out of prison, I may not do that again. The effectiveness of our penal system to do that is a topic for another day. Some people, we can see, choose ethics from reason. In other words, by thinking through what is a reasonable activity and understanding that they have to apply some level of self-restraint, and somehow that's an advantage. Many adapt ethics or adopt ethics as a form or a part of their religious observance. So we can see that with many of the great religions. In fact, all religions have an ethical code. When you talk to indigenous people, they might talk about their spirituality rather than their religion. But they will tell you that the supernatural creative agencies that made the world and made them also gave them a relationship to the land. Say the Aboriginal people in Australia, when asked about their property rights, they will say that the creative agencies, and there's many of them in Australia, almost as many as there are tribes, those creative agencies not only made the world and made the people in it, the tribe in particular, but they also gave the people their laws and customs. And so this means that if you talk ethics to an Aboriginal person, they will come back and talk spirituality to you. In former times in the West, Christianity was understood to supply the major share, in fact all, of the ethics or the moral thinking of the community. As our religious sensitivities change, then that means that our ethical sensitivities change as well. When we look at Islam or the Hindu religion or the Buddhist religion, we see similar things, that ethics is very much culturally specific, largely because the older cultures tend to rely very heavily on their religious beliefs for their ethical systems. That doesn't mean the ethical systems are necessarily radically different. Very few religions look fondly upon murder as a recreational pursuit. Some allow the killing of people who are outside of those people in the community. So if we look at the New Guinea natives with their practices of cannibalism, Maori sweeping down through New Zealand, basically eating the prior occupants, they didn't consider that murder because they considered that those other people were actually not people. They had an idea that murder was bad in amongst themselves and amongst the Maori or the New Guinea Islanders or the Fijians or wherever it is, but it simply was a different understanding to ours. The distinction there is that the idea of the cold-blooded killing of an innocent party, which is a reasonable definition for murder, simply didn't apply to killing these other people that weren't part of your tribe, in the same way that we wouldn't think too much of killing a cockroach or a mosquito or even a rabbit to eat. But we have to look at what the commonalities are and why it is that those things exist. And it turns out that while religion has provided ethical frameworks for people in the past, it is also possible to develop ethical systems purely from reason. And we're going to be looking about a bit of that shortly. Ultimately, everyone wants the other in a relationship to be ethical, at least to them. I might be a bank robber, but when I go to see my doctor, I don't expect him to practice euthanasia on me. I have my ethical indiscretions, robbing banks, but I expect everybody else to treat me fairly. If the police caught me and beat me senseless, I would consider that they were being unethical. Why should I be able to say that, considering I've stepped outside of the ethical obligations of my community? But we still do that. And that's pretty much the case even with minor things. We expect people to be honest to us. We expect people to not practice violence on us. Many, many places. And it's always one person expecting something of the other. Now, we've used a few terms here, and it's about time we gave you some definitions. We've been talking about ethics. Strictly speaking, an ethic is a set of morals. Just a set. A moral is a principle for the appropriate relations between persons. And so an ethic is really a system of morals. The reason we have professional ethics for doctors, and they're a bit different from the professional ethics for bankers or financial advisors, and they're a bit different from the professional ethics for engineers, is because those professions all meet the community in slightly different ways. The ethical challenges for a doctor are going to be different to the ethical challenges for a lawyer or an engineer or a financial advisor. What we will find is that there are fundamentals which are common, and we saw those in an earlier presentation. Things like integrity, trustworthiness, honesty, and so on. And so a moral is a principle for appropriate relations between persons. The study of morals makes up the science of moral philosophy. It is a branch of philosophy. There is a view today, and we'll look at the historical development of this view, that morals ultimately are a subjective set of rules that you apply to yourself. We're going to look at that question to see whether there's something more to moral principles than simply a personal decision. Because after all, if I'm going to be relating to other people and expecting them to act morally with respect to me, it's handy if there is some common, explicit, known ethical code that I'm expecting them to follow. It's not really good enough for me to come up to you and I say to you, I'm a moral person, I'm an ethical person, and you say, oh, that's really nice, and then you turn your back on me and I stab you to death or something and carry off and eat you. And you say, maybe your ghost says, "Hey, why did you do that?" And I reply very simply, "Well, my ethic, my moral system, allows me to eat you. And nothing wrong with that according to my moral system." And you would say, "Hey, I feel like I've been ripped off." So there's something about moral systems, ethics if you like, that needs to be outside of the individual actor, the individual agent. It needs to be something that the community needs to be able to rely upon. We'll get back to our definitions. We talked about the science of moral philosophy, and that might be a novel idea for many people, and because we normally think of science as the thing you do in a laboratory with test tubes or maybe oscilloscopes or telescopes or something, where we go off and observe a lot of things and we make some deductions from our observations. Those things, like chemistry, physics and so on, we can refer to those as the natural sciences. There are other sciences as well, so we need a definition of science. Mathematics, for instance, is a science. It doesn't have to do with observation. In fact, a mathematician, all of his science lives inside his head, and somehow they're able to communicate it to other mathematicians, and we all use mathematics. So what is a science? A science is a systematic body of knowledge, but it's more than that. Science is the pursuit of certain knowledge through cause. That's the classical definition of a science. And so mathematics becomes very evidently a science once we adopt that definition, because there's certain knowledge. I know that 2 + 2 = 4 because of the causality, the way that arithmetic works. And that gives me the confidence to know whether I'm doing some simple addition to work out my shopping list or my shopping cost, or designing the trajectory for a rocket going around the other side of the moon. In either case, I can have certain knowledge of the outcome. I have certain knowledge of the whole mechanics because I have this knowledge of the particular science. And we're talking about mathematics. Every science has its own appropriate method of inquiry. The methods of working out mathematics are very different to the methods of working out geology or physics or chemistry. The physicist especially certainly relies on observations primarily. Newton had to rely on an apple falling from a tree to then be able to abstract back into his laws of physics, which are really mathematical laws. When we do maths, however, we don't go looking to observe 2 + 2 = 4. We might see 2 frogs and 2 beetles, and we can say we've got 4 creatures there until the frogs eat them. When we're looking at mathematics, in fact, we don't look at it at all. We think about it. And so the method of discovering some new mathematical relationship, say chaos mathematics, fascinating new branch of mathematics, which is, well, only about half a century old. Okay. How do we get to chaos mathematics? Do we do that by going out and measuring things and taking observations? No, we didn't. We applied the rules of arithmetic with other rules for other parts of mathematics that we'd already known, and then applied them to a new situation in a new way and came up with a development of mathematics. No observation involved at all. Still absolutely certain in its outcome. It's certain knowledge through cause. And we find that with all sciences. When we get to the philosophical sciences, say logic or metaphysics or even moral philosophy, we find that each one of those has its own appropriate method of proceeding. In the same way that the method appropriate for mathematics is different to the method appropriate for physics, the method appropriate for the various branches of philosophy is very particular to those branches. And we can talk about other sciences as well, such as political science or what have you. Use a completely different method. But we still always come back to the pursuit, in fact, hopefully obtaining certain knowledge through cause. That leads us to the question of what knowledge is. The definition of knowledge goes back to Plato, back half a millennia before Christ. Knowledge is justified true belief. Each one of those words is quite rich and important. You can't know something which is false. I can't know that there are humans colonizing the moon. I might believe it, but I can't know it because it's not true, at least as far as we're aware. Not only does the belief have to be true for be knowledge, but it also has to be tested. It just might be that the Russians behind my back sent a rocket up to the moon, so there are humans up there. Okay? And so I really need to do a little bit of checking. I might say, for instance, I know it's raining in, let's say, Melbourne or the South Pole or Johannesburg or something. That might be true. It might be raining in Johannesburg. However, unless I actually check it these days by looking on my phone, it's only a guess. It might be it might be true. I might believe it, but unless I've done some reasonable investigation into it, it's not really knowledge. It's simply a guess. Justified true belief. And of course I have to actually have it in my head. There's no point in having some justified true idea if I don't believe it. If I do go off and check with all my might to find out if it's raining in Johannesburg, and they'll say, no, I do not believe that. Okay. A little bit silly, but I certainly don't have knowledge of what's happening in Johannesburg. So justified true belief goes back to Plato. This leads to one of the trickiest and slipperiest definitions probably in all of philosophy in our age. In early times it wasn't such a tricky or difficult concept, but today it is, for reasons that we might get into a little bit later. And that's that middle term in the definition of knowledge, the true part. What is truth? Often we now talk about, well, I've got my truth, you've got your truth. Truth is manufactured. Truth is argued over, all sorts of things. What is truth? Truth is the conformity of propositions to reality. Okay. It's a conformity. A more formal way of defining truth is to say that truth is the adequation of the intellect to the extra mental reality. It's a very fancy way of saying that there is something in my mind, in my intellect, which is adequate, not identical, but adequate. It parallels the extra mental reality, what's outside. Okay? I might think about the weather in Johannesburg. That's something that doesn't have to do with me. There may not be any people on the world, but it will still be either dry or raining in Johannesburg. Okay? That is an objective reality. What gets into my mind is in some ways a model of that reality. A statement, a proposition usually, sometimes a visual proposition, an image. But one way or another it is a set of propositions or visual propositions in my mind that either conforms or doesn't conform with the reality that it is meant to represent. What am I saying here? First of all, that truth is a mapping. It's a parallel, if you like. And if those things, the idea in my mind versus the extra mental reality, the thing that's actually happening in the concrete outside world, does not, if they're not equal, then that proposition in my mind, that thing in the intellect, is simply not true. That's a very fancy and complicated way about talking about truth. We might come back to the question of truth in a later class. For the present, you can just, first of all, memorize truth is the conformity of propositions with reality. In fact, I'd like you to commit to memory all the definitions on this slide. But then try and think of situations where it either works or it doesn't work, or is there another way of defining truth? That definition of truth actually makes life an awful lot easier. It's what the average person thinks when they're not trying to fool themselves or others into something which is, maybe to their advantage, but not actually real. Let's look at some questions now that arise from all of this. We're talking about things in the intellect, propositions, statements in our mind, in our memory. We can ask the question, what kind of existence do those ideas have? My idea, I can think of a motorbike. Does that mean I have a motorbike in my head? But somehow I have something about the motorbike which is in my head. I might have a moral idea. It might be, you shouldn't murder people. What kind of an existence does that have? What's inside my mind? How does that connect with the outside world? Is there a notion of truth which applies to moral principles? That's a major question that we need to look at closely. The next question, which is relevant, is the question of the comparability of moral principles. If I believe in slavery or cannibalism and you don't, is there a way of testing whether my ideas are better than yours? It has been said that if I have the more effective military technology, then I'm right. That goes back to an idea coming from Plato in the Republic, where he had one of his discussants, Thrasymachus, suggest that justice was the will of the stronger party. When you think about the Thrasymachus approach to justice, it becomes rather creepy, unless you see yourself as always being the stronger party. Might is right, and that sort of thing. So how can we compare moral principles? So we need to be able to do that. How are morals connected to physical reality? Third question. It's one thing to say, murdering people or killing other people is simply a cultural rule. Is there a way of establishing that the cold-blooded killing of innocent people is in fact something which violates some aspect, something which is knowable from physical reality? From that, we can ask the question, is moral philosophy really a science? It's certainly not a science like physics or chemistry. But can we have certain knowledge through cause? Especially when we start looking at different moral systems, we'll find that making sense of that question is a bit trickier than it first appears. And of course, if moral philosophy is really a science, we can ask ourselves the question, how much can we be absolutely certain about it? This gets right to the question of, are there good and bad, or good or bad, moral systems? Are there some moral systems that we should be very cautious of, even despite their popularity? And the last issue is, how do we go about answering all of the above questions? What method is appropriate for the study of morals? To give us a little bit of an introduction to this, I'm going to do a little bit of history. I'm going to particularly look at the early Greek cultures. We can learn a lot from history, and especially ancient history. It's not to say that the Greeks always did everything really marvellously, but we can see their doings and see the things that they did that caused things to go well, the things that they did that caused things to go badly, and we can draw some conclusions for ourselves. The early Greeks their culture can be separated into a number of eras. The two parts of the Greek history, if you like, that I'm going to be interested in at present is that part of Greek history from about 600 to 800 years BC to the time of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. Or Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, put them in chronological order. That was also the time, roughly, of Alexander the Great. And the reason that those two, the two periods, up till Alexander the Great and Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and then after Alexander the Great, pretty much until Greece was overtaken by Rome, make these two distinct phases in the history of Greece. There was earlier history that we're not really interested in so much, back around 800 or 1000 BC. Interesting but not relevant for our present purposes. And the reason that the Greeks became interesting for our study is that it was around the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle that we got to know a lot more about the Greek culture, largely because it had become quite affluent, and so it had the wealth and the comfort to be able to indulge in writing history, at least writing anything. And so we can look at the Greeks as the earliest example of a culture going through the different phases of its cultural life. The Greek thinker Socrates could remember when the Greeks were actually getting stronger and stronger year by year as a culture. However, he was also quite aware that from the time of his childhood until the time when he started to take an active interest in teaching philosophy, or at least exploring philosophical questions, something had changed in Greece. It turns out that we can see these changes, these cultural changes, happening in other cultures as well. But for the present, we'll simply look at the changes in Greece. So during Socrates' life, Greece had gone from being one form of culture to another. And largely the change was the result of an ethical change. To understand the ethical change, we have to look at the first group of people to set themselves to the task of what we now call philosophy. These people didn't call themselves philosophers, they actually called themselves sophists, which in Greece means wise men. And the sophists were distinctive because they were teachers. They earned their living by charging fees for teaching their ideas, their philosophy. The sophists knew that the best way to get the maximum number of customers was to teach things that people wanted to hear. And Greece at that time was affluent and it was becoming rather self-indulgent. And so the sophists realized that their customers, their clients, wanted a philosophy that enabled them to feel comfortable about their various indulgences. They were paid educators and they had to set about working out a philosophical system and a moral system which basically kept them in business. The sophists were what today we would call relativists. They were of the opinion that morals came from the person, which meant that the person made their decisions, they made up their own moral code, which meant that unto themselves they would be moral, even if the people around them didn't actually think so. And it gave them a certain amount of moral latitude. The sophists are remembered for a fundamental principle that can be distilled down to a very simple maxim, and that is seek pleasure and harm no one. The sophists were flourishing at a time when the Greeks had built up a considerable empire. It wasn't quite as great as what it got to under Alexander, but it was still quite considerable. They lived very comfortably. You build up an empire through hard work, largely in the military area. The sophist ethic, when you look at it, doesn't work well for military adventure. A soldier tends to live a very rough and dangerous life. If his moral goal was to seek pleasure, the comforts of the world, a warm bed every night, a full tummy, all of the comforts that wealth can bring, that doesn't really square well with going off to fight some neighbouring country or tribe. So to seek pleasure sounds good, but it doesn't work very well for a military man. And when you add it to the other part of the sophist principle, sophist maxim, harm no one, well, certainly there's not much good in being a soldier if you're also a radical pacifist. And so to a certain extent, the sophist approach, the wise men of Greece during this period, came in to tell people that if you're living a self-indulgent life, you're seeking pleasure, that's fine. So as long as you seek your pleasures but don't hurt anybody, then you're a good person. But what simultaneously happened, and of course while that's harmless, I mean today and maybe a generation ago, people were pursuing a very, very similar maxim, slightly different. Do what you like, or so long as you don't hurt anybody. It really goes back to the sophists. We can explore the logic behind the sophists further later on. But I think you can see that while the maxim sounds good when you first encounter it, seek comfort, seek, good things, seek pleasure, and harm no one. Oh, that seems to be, you're not going to hurt anyone that way. It doesn't work well when you go into the genuinely social, political, and apply that in the military sphere, but even domestically. One of the deeper elements of the sophist approach was this notion that morals came from the person. They weren't something that was bigger and more permanent than the individual deciding on them. And this was one of the major problems. That once the individual actor, the individual moral agent, decided on his own morals, then it really means that when you walk down the street, everyone you bump into would be following their own moral code, and therefore the likelihood of really being able to trust them goes down. Now, this doesn't mean that the Greeks suddenly became, sort of beasts and beat up on everyone and all the rest of it. But it did mean that whether it was in business or in family relations or, any other social encounters that people have, the level of trust was beginning to erode away. Now, obviously, you don't go from one extreme to the other, but just to add that element of mistrust caused a certain change, I guess, in the Greek culture, one that went from people being able to trust other Greeks and respect them for, the quality of their Greek culture, to starting to treat them with a certain amount of misgiving, a certain amount of mistrust. This was the environment that Socrates found himself in. He could see that over the last, few decades of his life, something had come into the Greek culture that was different. Now, it's one thing to say, every generation or the old people are always saying it was better in my day, or it was better when I was at school, or whatever it is. But there are times in history where that observation, it was better when I was a kid, has more strength or less strength, more accuracy. And the era through which Socrates lived was certainly one place where there was an observable, a very concrete and very strong difference between the cultural values of Socrates as a youngster compared to the values that Socrates saw around him as an older man. And largely this is what became his philosophy, trying to articulate the values, the thinking of this earlier time, because he could see that Greece was starting to fall apart around him. And certainly by the time you get to Aristotle, in terms of these three men, by the way, you have Socrates, who taught Plato. So it's kind of, if you like, a generational gap there from Socrates to Plato. And then there was another generational gap from Plato to Aristotle. So they were connected to the extent that they followed one after the other and they had influence on each other. They weren't all absolute contemporaries. They weren't all going to school together, or they weren't the same age or near the same age. So we're really looking at, if you like, almost three generations of thought. Socrates began this adventure of trying to work out what philosophical system, what moral system as well, made a culture robust. And that was then developed and refined by his student Plato. And Plato's thought was developed and refined by Aristotle. These three thinkers were what we call in philosophy realists. They were of the opinion that the outside world, in other words, what is outside of the person who's doing the philosophy, what exists outside is real and it's knowable. These are two questions that have actually plagued the thinking through human history. In some areas, we find that people are of the opinion that when I look at a sunset, there really is a sun and it really is falling below the horizon, and other people think that they're living in something like The Matrix, the movie The Matrix, where it's all just imaginary. I'm not really sure if it's there. It looks like it's there. All my senses say it's there, but it may not be real. If I live in this world where I don't believe in reality, it becomes a very lonely world because there's no real relationship. If you're watching this video and thinking to yourself, I wonder if Garrick Small really exists, if I'm just a computer program like The Matrix, then you can treat me in a different way to if I'm another human being with the same intellectual capacities and moral obligations between the two of us. Okay. This question of reality existing sounds a rather bizarre to question, but as I say, the sophists were acting as though the outside world was unknowable. The sophists didn't quite go that far. That sort of came later with the modern thinkers, especially David Hume is a good example of this. David Hume, when he was writing philosophy, at one point writes how when he's doing philosophy, he cannot be sure if his maid existed. However, he writes, it is more convenient to do so when she brings me the tea. And so what Hume is saying there is that when he's acting as a philosopher, he's not sure whether the outside world exists and his maid and her tea tray and everything else. But when he stops doing his philosophy because he's a bit hungry, he finds it more convenient to believe she's actually there. Well, that's rather bizarre because, what happens if he decided not to believe that and, tried to put his hand through a face or something? It's really quite a bizarre belief, but it is something which now is very, very common, to the point where most people consider that philosophy is really no more than an intellectual game, something more of a puzzle or a bit like playing cheat at cards, where you've got people sitting around trying to prove through fancy argument that black equals white or night equals day or something crazy. Largely that comes from this tradition that was started with the sophists. It was developed by people like David Hume, and these people flourished at parts of history or parts of their own culture's history that were positively disposed to this rather odd belief that reality doesn't really exist. By contrast, Socrates looked back at the people who made Greece great, which could have been people of his parents' generation and so on, and he looked at it and he thought, well, they just do what Monty Python would have once called the bleeding obvious. Of course reality exists, there's so much evidence for it, and the likelihood of it not existing is just not something that you would seriously consider without sort of finding yourself institutionalized. But that gave rise to the philosophical tradition which we call realism. We'll call the ancient Greeks classical realists. Really, the average person, from the time they can talk up until the time when they study modern philosophy at university, tend to be realists. Tradesmen and practical people who actually do things in the world are naturally realist. Technically, we would call them naive realists because they haven't studied philosophy, but they just assume that the real world exists and they can know the real world and they can experience the real world, and when they have experiences, it's real. Now, if you think that is crazy stuff to have to talk about, you're probably right. However, we need to talk about it because almost all modern philosophy began around the year 1500 with the work of Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, who was an Italian who wrote a book called The Prince. And in The Prince, Machiavelli argued that appearance and personal decisions were more important than reality, specifically in the area of moral principles, ethics if you like, applied to political leadership. That's a topic for another day. My point is that the relativist, the subjectivist traditions pop up in history from time to time, and the first example of it was the sophists. And they were, contrasted rather to the realists. There have been other branches of realism. The most developed is what we could call moderate realism, flourished in the period roughly 1100 to about 1400, and sort of has remained strong in some parts of the West since then, moderate realism. And so we see these philosophical systems, even though they come at various different parts of history, actually connecting together. The classical realists had a similar maxim to the sophists. They were attempting a systematic defense of earlier Greek thought. And so they were looking back and saying, well, there was things that worked in the early Greek thinking that have actually been thrown out by the sophists. Let's get back to them because we'd like to put Greece back on the rails to cultural dominance, cultural power. Aristotle came up with a maxim which is quite straightforward, and in fact at a distance it looks very similar to the sophist maxim. Aristotle said, do good, avoid evil. It looks the same. If humans are simply material animals, the only thing which is ultimately good is what feels good, looks good, sounds good, tastes good. And so there's a kind of a rough equality between pleasure and good. Although Aristotle, by choosing the word good rather than the word pleasure, he opened the objective to something bigger than simply physical enjoyments. The good can also include things like heroism and other attitudes or something, other things that are very real in human experience, love, for instance, that is not really accommodated with the radically materialist approach of seeking pleasure. Likewise, harming no one is sometimes quite different to avoiding evil. Avoiding doing evil, yes, that does mean that you don't murder people, and harming no one is also served by not murdering people. But sometimes avoiding evil means doing things which might appear to be harmful. If someone jumps in the window about to do some dreadful violence to your young children, you might be inclined to harm them. You might be inclined to fight them off, hit them over the head with a frying pan or something. Okay? That's harming them. And the reason is that's your only way of avoiding evil. For much of Western history, we had principles for international law, and also for things like international sort of codes for military activities. There was such a thing as a just war. A just war, which can be thought of as a defensive war. If an army comes and starts to attack your country, doing harm to them is quite a useful, moral, ethical way of keeping the peace. So there's this major distinction: do good and avoid evil, while it approximates the seek pleasure and harm no one of the sophists. When it counts, it actually can come to ethical decisions, moral conclusions that are radically different. I'm stressing this because as we go through this unit, I would like you to think about the contrast between these two maxims. We will find them paralleled, developed in some ways, but sort of popping up in some sense in other places through the history of ethical thought. When we apply them to professional activities, the seek pleasure and harm no one, you can look at ethical situations, case studies or what have you, see if that actually works. And very often you'll find that the do good and avoid evil actually is more robust. Of course, it doesn't answer the question, what is good? Or for that matter, what is evil? That's a job for another day. One of the other important things about the classical realists is that they believed, and I think with good cause, that morals were objective. Morals are found, they are not made. They don't come from the human actor. They're something that the human actor has to discover because they're out there. They have a reality which is different to the reality of a rock or a bird, but it's nevertheless a form of objective reality, separate reality to the seeker. We'll now just have a quick look at how these two approaches affected Greece. What we're going to do is look at a little bit of a timeline that later on in the unit we will come back to and we will complete. But for now, we'll just look at the Greek Empire. Greece went through, well, it's believed to have gone through a dark age back around 800 BC. But coming out of that dark age was the flourishing of the best of Greek culture. And so we can put it on this timeline as an upward line here, and that's meant to reflect the performance, if you like, of the Greek culture. And we can use measures like its economic strength, its political strength, its cultural strength, its cultural achievements, standards of living. They were all rising from that dark age around 800 BC, we believe, up until we get close to the time of Socrates, Aristotle, and Plato. From about the time of Alexander the Great, Greece was in eclipse. It was getting worse year by year, and ultimately it was taken over by the Romans. That's a story for another day. But we don't see Greece as a big player in world history and politics and so on, say in the last 1,000 or even 2,000 years. So there was the Byzantium Empire. That was probably, well, it certainly wasn't the classical Greek culture. We've been arguing so far that the sophists really were the turning point in Greek thinking. And so I'm drawing in the sophists there with a dotted line which is heading downwards. It's heading downwards some time, considerable time, before the culture as a whole, politically, economically and so on, started to fall. It represents the thinking of the culture. That decay in the philosophical quality of educated Greeks, or Greeks in general, was very much facilitated, represented by the sophists. And even though the sophists were flourishing in a very affluent, successful culture, their thinking really was something that was, in a sense, anti-social. We've already seen that by looking at the seek pleasure and harm no one. I'll put in the realists, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle. You can see the decline there continuing, but under the realists at least you had a bit of a revival for a period, and it's worth noting that Alexander the Great was one of Aristotle's students. And so if we look at the history, Socrates had a student named Plato, Plato had a student named Aristotle, Aristotle had a student named Alexander, who went out to create what was at the time one of the greatest empires that the world had known up until that point. And so there's power, there's force, there's merit in realist thinking. At the period that we're talking about, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, it was largely done consciously by the activism in education of Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, realised in Alexander. But because the culture as a whole, if you like, had lost heart, the dominant influence was the sophists. Once Aristotle died, largely Greece continued in the self-indulgence that the sophists facilitated. And so we find that Greece fell apart. So what we have here is a contrast between two different ways of thinking. We had the relativism and the subjectivity of sophism coming into an otherwise healthy and growing culture. That healthy and growing culture kind of hung around a bit under the sophists, but in fact its moral heart, its philosophical heart had been subverted. It was revived a little bit under the realists. The realists at best could be understood as reinvigorating confidence in common sense ultimately. But once the age of those realists had passed, then Greece was no more. Okay, that introduces us to, if you like, the drama that's lying behind moral philosophy and its relationship to ethics and the rise and fall of civilizations. What we'll do now is, in our next presentation, we'll take that into looking at what happened later in history, in particular the history of the West.